Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me? If you think you're having any audio issues, you can just type it in your chat box there, and Tina is our organizer kind of behind the scenes, and she'll try to troubleshoot any issues that you may be having. Excuse me. So my name is Kim Lewis. I'm an occupational health and safety educational consultant with Workplace NL, and I'll be presenting today's webinar on selection considerations for personal protective equipment. So just a little bit about Workplace NL before we get started. Workplace NL serves approximately 215,000 workers and 1,800 employers in the province. Workplace NL administers an employer-funded, no-fault workers' compensation system that promotes healthy and safe workplaces, provides return-to-work programs, and offers compensation to injured workers and their dependents. At Workplace NL, we offer a learning series. So the Health and Safety Learning Series is a program that's designed and delivered by staff here to increase the education and awareness of occupational health and safety and return to work in the workplace. We provide workshops and webinars, and of course our in-person workshops have been suspended due to COVID, but these workshops and webinars address our injury priorities and our strategic mandate. So today's webinar is part of the learning series. I work in the Prevention Services Department, which is made up of a group of health and safety professionals that focus on promoting occupational health and safety education and awareness with employers and employees in our province. And we provide a variety of services, including occupational health and safety publications, general advice. We can provide statistics to an employer about their occupational health and safety performance. And we also, as I mentioned, provide these webinars and workshop series. So before we begin, I'll go over some housekeeping items. So in the handouts section in the control panel there on the right-hand side of your screen, you will find a PDF copy of the presentation that you can download while the webinar is active. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box, and Tina will coordinate those for me, and I'll answer any of your questions towards the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, because this is a pretty lengthy webinar today, I'll certainly follow up with you in an email. You'll also receive an evaluation once Tina closes out the webinar, and I'd encourage you to take the time to answer those few questions there, because it kind of gives us some feedback on, the topic and the relevancy and what you thought of the webinar. And every 30 minutes or so, we'll take a micro break. So I'll just ask you to stand up and stretch to give your body an opportunity to change posture and to get some blood flowing. So in today's webinar, we will explain the purpose of personal protective equipment. We'll talk about a little bit about personal protective equipment programs in the workplace. And then we'll look at several types of personal protective equipment. We'll reference the occupational health and safety regulations. And we'll talk about, where applicable, some CSA standards. So to get started then, what is personal protective equipment? So it is equipment or device that protects a worker's body from injury, illness, or death. So it acts as a barrier to protect the worker from the hazard. So the use of personal protective equipment certainly varies across industries according to the type of the work being conducted. So it has become a common element within workplaces. For example, we expect to see hard hats and work boots when we go on a construction site. We expect to see high visibility clothing, road crews. We expect to see flotation devices for people working, on or above water. But it is important to note that personal protective equipment is the least effective way to protect workers, because we're not eliminating or reducing the hazard. So for this reason, PPE is often described as the last line of defense. So right there, kind of right to the very bottom of the screen there. So for example, wearing hearing protection reduces the likelihood of hearing damage when the earplugs or the muffs are appropriate for the kind of noise exposure and when they are used properly. However, the hearing protection does not eliminate the noise itself, right? The noise hazard is still there. We're just using the hearing protection as that barrier between the worker and the hazard. So controlling a hazard at its source is the first choice because this method will eliminate the hazard then from the workplace altogether or isolate the worker from it. So when the hazard cannot be removed or controlled adequately, then personal protective equipment may be used. So when PPE is appropriately selected and properly used, it minimizes the exposure or reduces the severity of the injury or illness. There are some things to consider. Personal protective equipment should only be used when other controls are not available or when they're not adequate for the hazard. It should only be used as a short-term measure before controls are implemented. And during activities, such as maintenance, cleanup, and repair, when other controls are not feasible or they're not proven to be effective. And it should only be used during emergency situations. So it is important that people not have a false sense of security when wearing personal protective equipment, as the PPE does not remove the hazard, nor does it provide complete protection for the workers. The hazard is still there. So it has to be, selected properly based on the hazards. It has to be used properly, and it has certainly to be maintained properly in order for it to be effective. So that kind of brings us to personal protective equipment programs. So a PPE program helps employers select the right PPE for the job, and it then details the requirements for how that PPE is going to be used, cared for, and maintained. So it considers the health and safety hazards that are encountered in a workplace, and it requires the commitment, certainly, and compliance of both, or all workplace parties, really, the employers, the supervisors, and the workers. So separate programs may need to be developed to address, respiratory and hearing protection if those are hazards that are present in your workplace. So you may have a personal protective equipment program and also have a respiratory protection program and a hearing protection program. So a PPE program has to be comprehensive. It requires commitment and active participation in the planning, development, and implementation stages from all levels. So whether that's senior management, supervisors, and workers. So according to the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, or CCOHS, a good PPE program consists of these essential elements: hazard identification and risk assessment, making sure that appropriate controls are selected, the selection then of appropriate PPE, because you may still need to wear personal protective equipment even when other controls are put in place. The fitting then of that personal protective equipment, so making sure it is fit to the user. Education and training for the end user of the equipment. Management support, the maintenance of the program, and then of course auditing of the program for a quality control check. So PPE programs must be seen to have equal importance as all other organizational policies, procedures, and programs. Same with your occupational health and safety programs. So there should be an appointment of a program coordinator, so someone who is going to oversee the PPE program, and they're making sure then that each element of that program is in place and operational. So the greater the worker's involvement in all stages of the PPE program, the smoother the program will be to implement. Users should be educated about why the PPE is to be worn, and then trained certainly in how to properly use it. So the method of implementation affects the acceptance and the effectiveness then of the whole program. So how it is perceived in the workplace, or how it is welcomed in the workplace. So in addition, worker compliance with the PPE program is likely to be poor if the personal protective equipment is, unattractive or uncomfortable, or it's imposed on the worker with little choice in the selection process. So, where possible, it's important to offer some flexibility in terms of, the various models or the makes of the required personal protective equipment, while maintaining then the appropriate level of protection. So when selecting appropriate personal protective equipment as part of your PPE program, you must consider the hazard assessment of your workplace. Looking at what the legislation says, which we're going to look at today, if there's applicable CSA standard, what the limitations of that PPE is, or that specific piece of equipment. How compatible is it with other PPE that has to be worn? So if we need to wear, let's say, respiratory protection, how can that fit when we also require eye protection? So everything has to be compatible. And then of course there's user preferences, and those things include comfort and fit. So poor fitting PPE can be uncomfortable, it can be ineffective, and it can be even hazardous. So if it's not fitting properly, then this goes back to that false sense of security. I feel like, hey, I got my respirator on, I'm protected, but if I'm not wearing it properly, then in actual fact, I'm not protected. Many types of PPE are adjustable, but never assume one type or size fits everybody. And certainly the key is to fit each worker with the personal protective equipment on an individual basis. So at the time of fitting, then also showing each worker how to wear and maintain the PPE properly. And then of course, like anything, there has to be cost considerations as well, and what is cost effective for the organization or for the worker. So Section 72 of our Occupational Health and Safety Regulation says that an employer has to ensure that a worker who wears personal protective equipment is adequately instructed in how to correctly use it, what its limitations are, and what maintenance is required for that equipment. So your PPE program then would be incomplete without some kind of training to make sure that equipment is worn and used properly. So using PPE requires, hazard awareness and training on the part of the user. So employees must be aware that, the equipment alone, as we've mentioned now a couple of times, does not eliminate the hazard. So if the equipment fails, then there's going to be exposure. So it's not good enough to tell someone to wear a respirator just because management says or because the legislation requires it. If the respirator is intended to prevent lung disorders, then the workers have to be informed then of those hazards. So they're fully aware then that if that respirator fails, or if it's not used properly, or if it's not maintained in good condition, then they are going to be exposed to those hazards for developing a lung disorder. So to reduce the possibility of failure, then equipment must be properly fitted and maintained in clean and a serviceable condition. So workers and their supervisors will require education, and as a minimum, employees using PPE must be trained in when it's necessary, why it's important, what type is necessary, how it should be worn, what its particular limitations are, and then how to properly care, maintain it. And if we're talking about a respirator or even some other pieces of equipment, its useful life and then proper disposal. And of course, retraining then would also be required if workers, don't seem to understand how to use the equipment properly, if they are indeed using it improperly, or if their job changes and maybe their PPE requirements change. Okay, so let's, I guess, get right into it. So before we start talking about specific types of personal protective equipment, so we'll just look briefly at personal clothing and accessories, and that's covered in Section 73 of our regulations. So personal clothing and accessories have to be of a type and in a condition that's not going to expose a worker to an unnecessary hazard. So for example, cotton is the best material, synthetic materials melt easily and they may burn rapidly. So the legislation also says then that if there's going to be a danger of the individual coming into contact with moving parts, or if there could be any electrically energized equipment present, then whatever clothing that worker is going to wear has to fit close to their body. They should not be wearing dangling articles. So an example of that, would be, hoodie strings. So if you have a hoodie on, whether you have the hood up or not, if there's dangling strings, then of course they should not be worn where there is a danger of entanglement. And the exception to that is medical arc bracelets, which are permitted to be worn with transparent bands that hold the bracelets snugly to the skin. And any facial hair or long hair has to be confined or worn at length, then that it's again not going to pose that hazard of being snagged or caught in a piece of moving equipment. So some common best practices that we tend to see in various industries is long sleeve shirts, no hoodies, long pants, long hair, that has to be tucked away underneath a hard hat, that people are clean shaven, and certainly that there is, no jewelry. It is dangerous to wear rings at work. So even a ring that fits your finger perfectly poses a hazard. So if the ring, is forced off or breaks, it could pull the flesh from the finger, or even in severe situations, it could amputate it. And so then we have head protection, and head protection is covered in section 74 of the regulations. So according to the Ontario Ministry of Health, approximately 9% of all workplace injuries are head injuries, and approximately 84% of employees who receive a head injury were not wearing head protection. So our legislation states that head protection must be used by all persons that are engaged in work where there is a hazard from falling or fixed objects or electrical shock. So this protection must meet CSA ZAG 94.1, which is industrial protective headgear. And the most recent revision was in 2015, and that was reaffirmed again in 2020. So there are various types of head protection available. So you can see there on the slide, we have some various types there. So we have the ballistic helmets, so also known as, bulletproof helmets, and they exist to protect the owner's head from receiving trauma and damage caused by, bullets, shrapnel, and other dangers. The next up one there is the bump caps. So worn when there is a risk of impact with stationary objects, such as working in spaces with low ceilings or that have hanging fixtures that you might, bump against, such as if you're in a confined space. And they're commonly used for, rescue teams and working from heights, and they are available with horizontal and vertical impact protection. And then we have the hard hat, and we'll look at that one in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. And then there's hair covers, so disposable or reusable, used certainly for hygiene reasons or to keep hair from being caught in the moving parts. So you can select a hard hat based upon the hazards, that you may be faced with. Hard hats are categorized as a class and a type. So we have Class E, which is electrical, Class G for general, and Class C for conductive. And then our types there, type 1 and 2. Type 1 provides protection from vertical impact and penetration, and type 2 provides protection from vertical impact, horizontal impact, and penetration. So comfort and fit are important selection considerations when you're looking at picking a hard hat, and of course looking at the class and the type as well. So choose a hat that is adjustable. Hard hats may not be worn backwards unless they have the reverse orientation performance mark. So this is probably an issue that you have seen on certain sites. I know I've seen it in the course of my work, sometimes people having them on backwards when they don't have the reverse orientation performance mark. So of course, if that mark is not present, then the hat is not designed to be worn that way, hence then again providing that false sense of security that they feel like they have a hard hat on, and so that they would likely be protected. So it is important to look for that mark if your intention is to put it on in that reverse orientation. Then sections 75 to 77 of the regulations outline the requirements for eye and face protection. So in Canada, 200 workers sustain eye injuries on the job on a daily basis. So that translates into more than 73,000 eye injuries every year. So 70% of the eye injuries result from flying or falling objects, or with approximately 60% resulting from small particles. So the things that are invisible to the naked eye. So, dust blowing, potentially dust blowing into people's eyes, as an example. So the legislation states that where a worker is exposed to conditions that are likely then to cause an injury, or that are likely to irritate the eyes or the face, that the employer has to ensure that they wear, that workers are wearing appropriate and properly fitted face and eye protection. So the protection must comply with the CSA standard, and that particular standard is at 94.3 eye and face protectors. And the most recent revision of that standard is 2020. The legislation also goes on to say that if there is a danger of impact, so if you're performing a task or performing work in an area where there could be potential impact to the eyes, prescription lenses must not be used. So unless the lens is worn behind an impact rated eyewear. So simply just wearing your prescription eyeglasses, if there is a danger of impact, would not be allowed, sorry. Where the use of any polycarbonate or plastic prescription lenses are impractical and there is no danger of impact, a worker may use prescription lenses which meet the ANSI standard. And that standard is at 87.1 practice for occupational and educational eye and face protections. And of course, a lot of us use contact lenses. So the legislation does specifically reference contact lenses, and it states that adequate precautions must be taken where there is a hazardous substance or condition that may adversely affect a worker who wears contact lenses. So soft, gas permeable contact lenses are currently allowed to be worn with respiratory protection under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And contact lenses are not allowed to be worn during welding activities, and that is specifically stated in the CSA standard W117.2. So again, we talked about earlier, when you're developing your personal protective equipment program and selecting personal protective equipment, we mentioned that a hazard assessment is required. So this is where you would kind of determine that is, you know, if you're doing welding in the workplace, that certainly poses a hazard, particularly if you're going to have people who use contact lenses. So let's get into looking at the classes of eye and face protection. So there are 7 classes, and I'll take a few minutes to review each class. So class 1 is safety glasses, and of course a primary source of eye protection is the use of safety glasses. So they have to fit properly and certainly be used properly. So safety glasses are not sufficient for working around some chemicals. You know, you may need, you know, goggles or a face shield. The CSA stamp is usually on the frame inside the temple near the hinges. So that's how you can confirm whether or not they are indeed CSA approved. Certainly is looking for that logo. And CSA approved non-conductive frames would be required for performing electrical tasks. So these are available in over the glass or OTG for wearing over prescription glasses as well. And you can see there on the slide, there's just one picture there. So you can get partial and or side protection for impact resistant and non-ionizing radiation. So again, 1A side protectors, 1B side protectors, and a radiation protection. So again, a consideration if you're going to be performing certain tasks that require or would put the worker at in a situation where they could injure or irritate their eyes. Class 2 is the safety goggles. So safety goggles provide added protection from splashes and particulates, and some may include protection from gases and vapors as well. So indirect ventilation ports, not only to allow passage of air, but certainly to prevent fogging as well. Safety glasses are not sufficient for working around some chemicals, as we mentioned, so you may need then these goggles. And the radiation goggles are often eye cup style. And again, these are also available in over the glass. So you could wear your prescription glasses underneath the class 2 safety goggles. Class C is the welding helmets. Welding activities, including plasma, are cutting, gouging, and oxy-fuel cutting, will require the use of a welding helmet. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified welding fumes and UV radiation from welding as a group 1 carcinogen. So the agency's designation for agents that carry sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in humans. So it's important, of course, to have the appropriate eye and face protection. So a well-designed welding helmet can help reduce a welder's exposure to the fumes by diverting the plume away from the welder's breathing zone. So to protect the eyes, of course, when the visor is lifted, safety glasses must be worn underneath the helmet. And the CSA standard, again, that I mentioned, W117.2, states that contact lenses must not be worn by welders and welding personnel. Then class 4 are the welding hand and shields. So these are also resistant to impact, heat, radiation, and electricity. And just like the previous class, they are opaque to light. So they must be worn in conjunction with safety glasses or goggles. And again, covered under that CSA standard, W117.2, safety in welding, cutting, and allied processes. The most recent version is 2019. So remember, use the same shield as the welders if you are directly observing the welding arc as well. So they are numbered 2 to 14, and they protect against radiation, with higher numbers indicating the higher level of protection. Shaded lenses with no number may offer protection against visible light and glare, but they offer little to no protection from the actual radiation. Then we have class 5, which are loose-fitting helmets. So they provide both eye and face protection, and of course different classifications there. 5A for impact resistant window, 5B for dust, splash, and abrasion protection, 5C radiation protection, and 5D then the high heat applications. So you can really see here how the hazard assessment comes into play when you're thinking about what type of PPE you actually need to perform the task. So they may be worn in conjunction with safety glasses or goggles as well, and some provide that neck protection. So for example, in the second picture there that you see on the slide, you can see that it certainly extends down into the neck region. Class 6 are the face shields. So again, different categories within the face shields. So they do provide both eye and face protection. So 6A is your impact and your splash, and B is radiation, and 6C is high heat applications. So again, they could be worn in conjunction with safety glasses or goggles. They also provide some neck protection, and most face shields are designed to either be mounted on a hard hat or they include the head protection as well. So again, you can see there in the pictures. The second picture there includes the head protection, and the third picture then would be the style that would need to be mounted. And then we have our respirator face pieces. So these provide eye, face, and respiratory protection. And similar to the others, they have their own classifications. So 7A, impact and splash. B is radiation protection. C is the loose fitting hoods and the helmets. And then 7D is the loose fitting with the radiation protection as well. So it really boils down to exactly what you're doing and what the hazards are to determine then what type of eye and face protection is going to be necessary. So we'll just talk a second about lens coatings. So, don't be fooled by the color of the lenses, essentially. Always check the marking to determine the level of protection. So, if their coating is tinted, it's protecting against UV light. If they're photochromatic and it adjusts to the light conditions, then the protection against UV light. Something that's polarized is protecting against UV light as well as glare. So, Tinted glasses should not be worn indoors under normal lighting conditions, because of course that impacts visibility. And if people certainly can't see properly, then that opens up a whole host of other hazards as well. All right, so before I get into limb and body protection, we will take our first micro break. So I'll walk you through a quick stretch. Again, feel free to follow along with me if you wish, and if not, you can kind of do your own stretch, or you can take a few minutes to run off to the coffee machine or to the washroom or whatever you need to do. So I'm actually going to stand up because I've been seated so far during the webinar. So I'm going to stand up and I'm going to just keep my feet shoulder width apart. And I'm going to lower my shoulders down from my ears, because sometimes you may be even a little bit tense. You're not even realizing that you're scrunching up your shoulders. So I'm just going to lower my shoulders out of my ears. I'm going to stand up straight and I'm going to make my chest proud. And what I'm going to do is take my right ear and lower it down to my right shoulder. So I'm just going to slightly bend my right ear to my right shoulder. And if you want a little bit more of a stretch, certainly you can take your right hand and just slightly press down on the side of your head. And again, it's just meant to be a soft stretch. It's not meant to provide any discomfort or hurt. It should actually feel good. So I'm going to bring my head back to center, and I'm going to lower my left ear to my left shoulder. Same thing, if you want a little bit more of a stretch, you can just take your left hand and just slowly and softly press your head down. Then I'm going to bring my head back to center, and I'm going to tuck my chin into my chest. So I'm going to lower my chin to my chest and just feel that stretch up towards the back of my neck. And then to kind of stretch all that out or shake all that out, I'm just going to take my two hands and I'm going to clasp them behind my back. And I'm just going to press down. So again, standing tall, shoulders out of my ears, chest proud. And I'm just going to press down. Hands are clasped, and I'm just going to press them down to the floor. And again, feeling that stretch there in my upper arms and across the back of my shoulders. All right, I'm just going to shake it out a bit. I'm going to continue on. If you guys feel like you need a little bit more of a stretch, then by all means do that. So section 78 of the regulations covers off limb and body protection. According, again, to the Ontario Ministry of Health, 25% of all workplace accidents involve the hands, and 60% of hand injuries could be prevented with appropriate hand protection. So let's talk about some types of hand protection and ways that, or things that you could consider when selecting it. But first, legislation. So where there is a danger of injury or contamination, or if there's risk of someone's hands or skin or feet or body for that matter to be infected, the worker must wear properly fitting protective equipment appropriate to the work that they're doing and appropriate to the hazard. So again, it comes back to the hazard assessment as a vital element in the selection process. And so those dangers could be anything from, impact from flying objects. It could be opportunities to, become scraped, degraded, be cut or be punctured. There could be radiation hazards. It could be absorption of chemicals through the skin. It could be extreme temperatures, infectious materials. It could be shock. Any of these things, if they are present, certainly, then there has to be protection worn. So it is important in your selection process to remember that no material is hazard proof, that it's only resistant, and that no one material is going to be resistant to all of the chemical, biological, or physical hazards, and that even if it is resistant, it's not going to remain resistant to a specific hazard forever, okay? So there is, a useful life, and that should also be considered then and outlined in a personal protective equipment program as to what the useful life of specific pieces of PPE is, and when it's required to be changed out, or replaced. So for chemical hazards, consider permeation, degradation, and breakthrough times. So degradation and the rate at which a chemical will cause, physical deterioration of that material. So when will it become stiff? Will it become brittle? Just will it actually even maybe potentially dissolve? The permeation rate then, the rate at which that chemical will move through the actual material, and the breakthrough time, the time it takes the chemical to permeate through that material. So there's no glove material that will remain impervious to a specific chemical forever, as I mentioned. So, the term impervious or impermeable gloves, which is often found on safety data sheets, has, very limited value. And as I mentioned, so no one glove material is going to be resistant to all the chemicals. So some chemicals will travel through or permeate the glove in a few seconds, while other chemicals may take days or it may take even weeks. So really you need to be checking the safety data sheets or the SCS and the manufacturer specifications, which again goes back to that consideration as part of the PPE program. Permeation, of course, is different from penetration. So penetration occurs when the chemical leaks through the seams or a pinhole or other imperfections in the material, that could occur as it's used over time. So again, our occupational health and safety regulations 78 talk about the appropriate selection of equipment. So the insulated value of clothing selected must be based on the temperature and the anticipated metabolic rate of the work activity. So many manufacturers of insulated garments provide guidance for recommended temperature and metabolic rate ranges for their clothing, so the required insulation value. And cotton is not recommended as it loses its insulation value when it becomes wet. So we could be talking about any type of protection from aprons to coveralls to if you're working in a lab, it could be a lab coat, protective sleeves, elbow pads, gloves. If you're working with I don't know, say chainsaws, for example, it could be wearing protective chaps. It could be having your, boot covers or overshoes. It could be, knee pads even based on the type of work you're performing. So there's so many more examples. It could be having, lead-lined clothing or certain garments for, radiation protection. So as you mentioned, we talked about the materials of gloves. So there is no one glove that can provide protection against all potential hand hazards. So it is important then to select the most appropriate glove for the specific application and to determine how long it can be worn and whether that glove can be reused. So consider all possible hazards. So looking for the physical hazards, the chemical hazards, the biological hazards, and the potential then health effect for skin exposure. You're thinking about things such as dexterity, flexibility, and touch sensitivity. So that's going to dictate the thickness and the material that you choose. If you're looking at disposable, for biological hazards, then you need to be choosing disposable gloves. So then on the slide there, we talk about some different types of hand protection. So that's your glove consideration. So mitts then, similar to gloves, but have a division certainly for the thumb and for one of the fingers. The hand pads, they protect the palm from cuts and from friction and temperature or vibration. Then the sleeves and the forearm cuffs, so they're going to provide an extension of protection, if you need it for the wrists and the arms. Things like finger cuffs, so provide protection for a single finger or a fingertip. You could have things like thimbles, so used to protect the thumb and or the first two fingers. You can get things like barrier creams. So it's a cream designed to protect against specific low or mild chemical hazards that may be encountered. The effects of excessive perspiration even, you can use a barrier cream for that. Or, to make even cleanup easier if there's heavy soil, heavy soiling is part of the process. And barrier creams can be used alone, or they can be used with other forms of hand protection as well. So here on the slide, you'll see some common glove types. So again, none of these gloves should be used for protection from chemicals. Chemical gloves we'll look at in the next slide. So the ones we have here are, the first one up is aluminized. So that is heat retardant and certainly not to be used for or used around any electrical hazards. Then we have the cotton or the canvas glove. So generally used for light work or just, general duties. They can provide the general protection and resistant to cuts and abrasions. There's moderate resistance, certainly to heat and cold, but they're not ideal for using in wet work. Then there's our leather style gloves, so general protection and resistant to cuts and abrasions as well, providing that moderate resistance to heat and cold. They will provide minor protection from sparks, but again, not for wet work, not for performing in wet work. And I think the pictures are a little bit mixed up here. Then there's nitrile coated gloves. So typically a cotton or a canvas glove with a nitrile coated palm, and of course that would enhance grip. Then we have our Kevlar gloves, so they are cut resistant. So certainly if you're doing something in the workplace where there is a significant risk of cuts, then Kevlar gloves may be an appropriate option. Then there's metal mesh, so also cut and slice resistant, but there is heavy options for heavy and low dexterity as well. Then there's the fire retardant gloves and the vibration ones. So vibration can cause, serious damage to the feeling in your hands and your arms, especially if you are regularly using a power tool. So there is a condition called vibration-induced white finger, which can give you symptoms such as, loss of sensation, loss of your light touch, or even, loss of grip. There could even be like bone cysts and pain or cold sensations that you would feel. So to help prevent that, wear, full-fingered anti-vibration gloves that meet the requirements of the ISO standard. But be advised that anti-vibration gloves do not provide significant risk reduction at frequencies below 150 hertz. So since the vibration emissions of most powered hand tools are below 150 hertz, the reduction in vibration provided by anti-vibration gloves is negligible in most cases, really. Then there's insulating gloves, certainly that will provide protection from temperature extremes. And then the last one there is the cryogenic gloves. They protect against tissue damage from cryogens or very cold containers and equipment. So again, not for use where there may be immersion. So choosing the correct glove can be difficult because no glove, as I mentioned, is resistant to all the chemicals, and no glove is chemical proof. But these would be these are some examples of some options when dealing with chemicals. So information specifying the best type of chemical protective material is what should be used on the safety data sheet. So you'll see maybe reference to neoprene or butyl rubber. So if this information is missing, you really should contact the supplier or the manufacturer of the product, because selection for protection against chemical mixtures is especially difficult. You may also require, double gloving, so the wearing of one type of glove over another type. So let's go through some of these different types of gloves for chemicals. So the butyl rubber there, so used against polar organics like acetone, they are ineffective against hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents. They will provide a moderate resistance to cuts and snags and puncture and abrasion. There is a type of butyl glove, the Viton or Viton. It's recommended for use with chlorinated and aromatic solvents, but you wouldn't use it with certain ketones or esters because it has it provides limited resistance as well to cuts and snags. It's a specialty glove, so it is going to be expensive. Then we have latex gloves, so a natural rubber material, often made into, the thin disposable gloves that are pretty commonplace, that you may see in a variety of workplaces, but they offer very little chemical resistance. So workers who use latex gloves are at a risk of developing contact dermatitis and asthma. So if latex gloves are used, you should be selecting the powder-free gloves with reduced protein content to try to avoid introducing any additional hazards. Then there's natural rubber gloves, so provide protection for bases, alcohols, dilute water solutions. You may hear them referred to as electrician's gloves. They are low cost and they do provide some dexterity. They are not resistant against most chemicals, and they do have some allergenic components. So workers who use these gloves, again, are at risk for developing the contact dermatitis. Then you have your neoprene gloves. So this is synthetic rubber offers resistance to a broad range of chemicals. So everything from oils to solvents, acids, and caustics. The neoprene remains flexible at low temperatures, but it offers only limited protection from cuts and snags. And again, there is that risk of developing contact dermatitis. So there are a number of cases of contact dermatitis due to neoprene that have been reported in the literature. The majority of these have been due to neoprene in wetsuits, but other sources of neoprene such as splints and keyboard wrist rests have also been known to produce contact reactions to that substance as well. Then we have the nitrile glove. So that's a synthetic rubber that offers protections, again, from oils, grease, many solvents, and acids and caustics. It also offers good puncture, cut, and abrasion resistance, but they're not recommended for ketones and some organic solvents. They are an inexpensive glove and they provide excellent dexterity. Then you have the Norfoil or Silver Shield. So they are lightweight, flexible foil laminate, and it stands up to almost any chemical. They're often used as an overglove. So particularly when you see people go out in hazmat suits, or so used as an overglove in hazmat incidents. They are a specialty glove, so they will be expensive. There is a poor fit, as you can see there kind of in the picture. They easily puncture and they would provide a poor grip. Again, partially due to that fit. Then we have the polyvinyl alcohol, or the PVA. So they have a high resistance to aliphatic and aromatic hydrocarbons, our chlorinated solvents, our esters, and most ketones. The glove will break down in water and in light alcohols, though, but they will provide resistance to cuts and abrasions. Then we have our polyvinyl chloride, or PVC. So again, a synthetic thermoplastic polymer that offers protection from many of the acids, caustics, and alcohols that you may be exposed to. They provide good protection from abrasion, but some of the glove styles are susceptible to cuts, so some more than others. They are not recommended for ketones and other solvents, and they offer near bare hand and dexterity sensitivity. And they also have some anti-static properties. And then of course you can have the lead line for radiation protection. So I think, pretty much what it boils down to, if you're dealing with chemicals in the workplace and looking to select the appropriate type of hand protection, is you really need to refer back to the safety data sheet to see exactly what the recommendations are. And if there is no specific reference to it on the safety data sheet, then the best advice is to get in touch with the supplier or the manufacturer of the chemical to see exactly what is required for handling. So how you wear limb and body protection certainly will have a major impact on how effective it is. So tight-fitting limb and body protection can cause, restricted motion and discomfort. And certainly if it's loose, then it may pose a hazard around moving equipment. So never assume that one type or size, fits all. But in order to have it provide the proper protection, it has to cover all the susceptible areas. So if we think of eyewear, face shields cover more than goggles, which cover more than safety glasses, right? So thinking about appropriate coverage. You can overlap in a way to direct splashes away from some of the inner layers. So if there is a splash hazard, it's no good to tuck your pants into your boots because the material may end up into your boot. So thinking about how you're wearing this protection as well is important. And in some cases, taping at the wrists and ankles may be required so that it's not going to get in at the skin. And of course, you always need to watch out for bleeding as well. So, wet pant cuffs, because, boots are not high enough, potentially. Dirty interior shirt cuffs indicate that, maybe a gauntlet style glove or taping is going to be required. So, there may be indications to you at the end of the day that maybe it wasn't providing you with the adequate level of coverage or protection that you needed. And then, of course, we also need to think about our sun protection factor. So SPF is an index of protection against reddening, certainly of the skin. So sunscreens with really high SPF, such as SPF 75 or SPF 100, really do not offer significantly greater protection than an SPF of 30. So major issues with sunscreen are that, it's not used on the job site or in the workplace, not enough is applied, or it's not applied to all areas, or that it's not reapplied frequently enough. So again, it is important as part of a hazard assessment for your workplace or your job site, obviously, particularly if you're doing work outside, is that you're considering the amount of time that workers are spending exposed to the sun, and then determining, what appropriate sun protection is required, and that would include certainly sunscreen. And of course, we know that wide spectrum sunscreen absorbs UVA, UVB, or both, and that it is rated based on an SPF. So there is no sunscreen that's going to provide 100% protection, and no sunscreen is truly waterproof. But the protection that provides, like we said, is based on, it has to be used, enough has to be applied, it has to be applied in all areas, and it has to be reapplied frequently enough. So next up is leg protection, and that's covered under Section 79 of the regulations. So leg protection, clothing, whether it's pants or chaps, with a minimum of 3 piles of ballistic nylon in the front or the rear. For example, regular pants that have had, safety pads sewn in, or any factory manufactured pants with pads in the front only are not acceptable to be used. Our legislation says that if someone is operating a chainsaw, they have to wear a leg protective device with a label permanently affixed to the outer surface indicating that the standard that it meets. And I won't get into talking about all these because it can be quite complicated, but if you are an employer that has a worker who is using chainsaws, then the chainsaw leg protection that they are using has to comply with the standard. And so there are a couple of different standards there that are referenced on that slide. Section 80 talks about foot protection. So according to the US Board of Labor Statistics, 66% of workers with foot injuries were wearing safety footwear. 85 were injured because the object hit an unprotected part of the boot that they were wearing, and 33% of workers with foot injuries were not wearing safety footwear at all. So the typical foot injury was caused by objects falling fewer than 4 feet, and the median weight was about 65 pounds. So most of the employers did not require their workers to actually wear safety shoes in these situations. And again, most workers were injured while performing their normal job activities at their work sites. So specifically, our legislation states that where protective footwear is required to have toe protection, metatarsal protection, puncture-resistant soles, or dielectric protection, the protection must comply with CSA standard ZAD 195 protective footwear. And the most recent revision was made in 2019. So many workers don't realize how important proper safety footwear is on the job, and thus choose, subpar construction work boots, essentially. And that certainly can increase the hazards, and it can increase discomfort, and certainly it can increase fatigue as well. So there's many different types of foot protection. You can get, shoes, boots, you can get shoe covers, you can get toe caps, there can be metatarsal guards or anti-slip overshoes. And you can also get, chemical resistant boots, and you can get ones that offer the insulating feature, so capturing the body's heat to protect against, frostbite. So there's many different types, and we'll talk a little bit about some selection considerations. So toe protection types. So we know that you can get steel toes, so they are the heaviest, they are the most compact, and they can conduct temperature and electricity. There's also aluminum toes, so they would be the lightest. They are of a moderate thickness, and they also have those conductive properties. And then there's the composite toes. So, made of carbon fiber, made of plastic or Kevlar. They are of a modest weight, but they would be the thickest. They do not conduct cold or heat, and they are useful for workers who have to regularly pass through metal detectors as well. So no issues certainly with setting off metal detectors with the composite toes. So like all CSA footwear, you will see grades and symbols. So the labels are on the tongues of the right shoe at the ankle height. They may also appear at ankle height on the shoe itself if it's electrical protection footwear. And these are on the slide. There are some of the markings that you would see and what exactly that means. So I mean, I'm not gonna read out the slide to you because you are able to take that away for reference as well. But those would be some of the grades and symbols that you would see, whether it's sole puncture protection, what grade of protective toe it is, and for what environment that it would be best used in, whether there are sharp objects, whether it's light industrial work, if puncture protection is required, or if it's in, an environment where the puncture protection is not required. And these are the symbols. So the grades on the previous slides, and these are some of the symbols that you will see. So the symbols here in this particular situation on this slide are referring to shock resistance and soles that are, dissipative of static, and what the grade protection is. And again, it provides you with the environments that you would use those in, and as well as in this case, some warnings about electrical shock resistance deteriorates with wear and in wet environments, or the footwear should not be used where there's going to be contact with live electrical conductors, or where, areas where you may need some static discharge. These are some additional symbols. So the first one there, soles that are electrically conductive. The second one is referring to metatarsal protection. And the bottom one there provides protection when using chainsaws. And again, the right side of the table giving you the column there for use. So whether it's used for industrial environments with low power electrical charge, where heavy objects can hurt the metatarsal region of the foot, or where they're working with or around handheld chainsaws. So again, as part of the selection process, you will determine exactly what environment the workers are going to be working in, what the hazards are, what level of protection is required, and then looking at the specific type of foot protection necessary based on the CSA standard and the grades and the symbols that are available. And I'll just clue up this section before we take our last micro break. So you will also see a 5-place alphanumeric code. And again, this provides important information for selection as well. So you'll see a 1 or a 2. So it's a grade 1 protective toe will give you the green triangle. The grade 2 protective toe will give you the yellow triangle. So as we looked on the previous slides, a P will mean that it's puncture resistant. An M provides that metatarsal protection. E would be referring to shock resistance. S, the static dissipation, or C, the conductive. And then an X in this case refers to chainsaw. And there is no symbol to indicate, a non-slip sole. So for example, you may see this 1POEO. So grade 1 protective toe, puncture and electrical shock resistant. So the 0 there, it's either puncture resistant or it's 0, metatarsal protection or 0. So in this case, this shoe provides no metatarsal protection and no protection for chainsaw use. And of course, comfort and fit are important parts of the selection process. So poorly fitting footwear certainly can create a hazard. So the boots should fit snugly around the heel and the ankle when it is laced up. There should be, ample toe room, and making allowances there for extra socks or inserts. So if you work outside and it's cold and you like to wear an extra pair of socks or a pair of vamps, as my nan used to call them, then you need to make allowances for those when you're thinking about sizing. A tip is to try footwear towards the end of the day, because typically feet swell up throughout the day based on, movement and water retention and whatnot. And of course, the boots should be laced up fully. So, when you're purchasing new boots, in addition to kind of trying them on midday or at the end of the day, walk in the new footwear to ensure that it's comfortable. Do some laps around the store or something. And don't buy them with the assumption that they're going to stretch with time. They should fit comfortably at the time of purchase. Ankle height certainly is important. So high cut boots provide support against ankle injuries, which may result, from slippery or uneven surfaces, particularly if we're thinking about some construction sites and there's some uneven ground that people may be walking over, or even in outside in the wintertime and things are frozen. And the ground is uneven, so there's certainly risk of ankle injuries. So many industrial sites require either a minimum of a 6 or an 8-inch safety boot, and you can get a 12-inch or greater, so when we're looking at things like hip waders. And of course, the higher cut boots, in addition to providing that ankle support, they also make it less likely that objects are going to drop down into the top of the boot. And again, on most workplaces, it will be specified what type of shoe or boot it would be best, i.e. what height is required. All right, guys, so we'll take just a few minutes and do a little stretch. I'm getting kind of close to the end of the webinar, but I still got a few slides to go through. So we'll do the same stretch just so makes it easier from an explanation point of view and amount of time. So I'm going to stand up again, standing up straight, feet just hip width apart. I'm going to take my shoulders down out of my ears. I'm going to put my chest proud and lower my right ear to my right shoulder. Hold that for a couple of seconds. I'm going to come back to center. I'm going to lower my left ear to my left shoulder. Come back to center. Lower my chin to my chest. All right, and I'm going to take my arms and I'm just going to stretch them out kind of in the shape of a T, and I'm going to put them behind my back and clasp my hands together and press down. And feeling that stretch kind of across your chest and in your upper arms as well. All right, guys, I'm just going to shake that out and continue on, but you feel free to stand up and move around, whatever your workstation permits you to do. So Section 81 of the regulations covers high visibility safety apparel. So specifically, it references that a worker whose duties are regularly performed in areas and under circumstances where they may be exposed to a danger of moving vehicles or even heavy equipment has to wear highly visible clothing, and that has to be suitable to both daytime and nighttime conditions, so whatever is appropriate. So it could be performing traffic control, you know, in certain seasons here in Newfoundland, you may be starting in the morning and it's dark, and you may be ending in the evening when it's dark. So that highly visible clothing has to be suitable for both daytime and nighttime operations. There is a CSA standard for that. It's ZAD 96, high visibility safety apparel, and that was most recently revised in 2020. Now, the CSA standard providing guidance for that is not referenced in our legislation, but there is a standard to provide guidance if you are an employer and you're looking for what would be most appropriate for your workplace. So on this table here, we provide a kind of just a visual cue for you of the different classes of high visibility apparel. So there are 3 classes: class 1 low risk, class 2 medium risk, and class 3 high risk. And it gives you a diagram showing you kind of the placement of the reflective material, and it gives you the dimensions for the coverage and the width of the material. So these are available in flame or water repellent resistant materials. Class 1 can be used over non-high visibility materials, and they're based on something called photometric performance, so the effectiveness of the retroreflective material. So level FR provides low reflectivity, retroreflective performance appropriate for flame resistant garments only. And then there's a level 1, it's high retroreflective performance, visible from a moderate distance. And a level 2, high retroreflective performance, visible from great distances. So with respect to the background material, you'll see there's fluorescent, and you may see the yellow-green or the orange-red, or you may see the red. And of course, they're brightly colored, so yellow-green, orange-red. So you may often see the vests or the full body protection or the coveralls, I guess. So these types of coveralls, they are common, but they are often old, so they may be designed to an earlier version of the CSA standard. On large sites with a dedicated emergency response team, sometimes the color red code is often reversed. If you see blue or black backgrounds with a class 2 or 3 striping, they must be classified as a class 1, as the most current version of the CSA standard no longer allows for blue or black backgrounds. So again, fluorescent and brightly colored. And these are some examples of the high visibility clothing types, that you can see: vests, jackets, bibbed coveralls, hooded jackets. There could be one-piece coveralls, there could be two-piece coveralls. You may see people wearing the rain gear as well. The breakaway design means that part of the apparel separates or would release when the force is applied to it. So that design is ideal when working near moving parts or equipment. And of course, sometimes it comes down to personal preference as well. Like, you may see other people wearing this that are not working around moving parts or equipment just because they like the design and they like the style of it. Others may find it somewhat frustrating if it's constantly coming apart. But again, the breakaway design is ideal in situations where there could be an accidental entanglement and it would easily break away, and allowing someone to get away certainly from that risk or that hazard. Section 82 of the regulations covers off flame-resistant clothing. So where a worker may be exposed to, a flash fire or an electrical equipment flashover, such as an arc flash, an employer must ensure that the worker is wearing flame-resistant outerwear. And the worker must ensure that, the clothing that they're wearing beneath that flame-resistant outerwear, right next to their skin, is made of flame-resistant fabrics or natural fibers that wouldn't melt, certainly if that was exposed to the heat. So workers should avoid undergarments containing, metal and synthetic fabrics. So no metal and no synthetics sounds pretty simple, right? Well, but then maybe you're a female and maybe you're wearing a bra. So a bra with no metal and no synthetics, like plastics, elastic, Velcro, spandex. So you can see here how it can become somewhat challenging, and thinking about all the different considerations that you would have to think about when selecting certainly those undergarments. So flame-resistant clothing is often, in dark colors to prevent light reflection. So again, you have flame-proof, flame-resistant, and flame-retardant. So flame-proof materials, there's pretty much, no such thing except for 100% asbestos cloth. That would be the only thing that we would 100% flame-proof. Our flame-resistant materials, so they're made from materials that are inherently non-flammable. So they will burn, but it will be very, very slowly, and they may even self-extinguish. Flame retardant materials, those are fabrics, made from any material, but are chemically treated, again, to be slow burning or self-extinguishing. They have to be periodically replaced because, of course, the more frequent that you wash them, you are removing that chemical treatment. So it can be anywhere from, 9 months to 5 years, and that certainly would depend on manufacturers' recommendations as well, and, use and how many times they are indeed, getting worn and washed. So flame-resistant clothing, or FRC. So typically long sleeve shirts with button cuffs and a collar, long pants that wouldn't have any cuffs that cover the tops of the boots. Fully laced fire-resistant boots with the spats, the gauntlet-style leather gloves, certainly that extend up over the wrist and part of the forearm, the leather aprons, and the skull caps or the balaclavas meet that category, or examples of what would meet in that category. So the FRC clothing has to be clearly labeled. So any details sewn into the garment must also be fire retardant. So sometimes if you see people putting in company names or logos, and of course that would also have to be fire retardant. If a non-fire retardant materials are used, they have to be attached in a way that wouldn't compromise the protection of the garment. They would be worn as the outermost part of the garment, except when other PPE is required to guard against a greater hazard. And again, any undergarments and street clothes, undergarments and street clothes may be worn under FRC materials, and non-FRC materials, maybe it's a coat, for example, may not be worn over FRC materials clothing. So arc flash, there's 5 levels of protection based on the level of risk, and there is a CSA standard as well that references that, and it's ZAD 462 Workplace Electrical Safety, with the most recent revision actually this year. So in the picture on the slide there, that's providing an example of a level 2 arc flash gear. So arc flash study would be required for each source, with the exception of, Newfoundland Power defines requirements for pulling meters. They say when you're pulling residential meters only, must be code 2 electrical, and must be performed by a journeyman. And then Newfoundland Power does commercial buildings. So again, this would be another consideration as part of of the hazard assessment if you have workers who will be exposed to the hazard of arc flash. And we have respiratory protection, which is covered under sections 83 to 86 of the legislation. Specifically, section 84 states that where engineering or other controls are not practical to protect a worker from an oxygen deficient atmosphere or one that contains harmful contaminants, appropriate respiratory protection has to be used. And there are 2 CSA standards referenced in relation to respiratory protection. So ZAD 94.4 talks about the selection, use, and care of respirators, and that was revised in 2018. And CSA standard ZAD 180.1 talks about compressed air breathing and systems, and that was revised in 2019. So when you're selecting a respirator, respirators are intended to protect the users from inhaling that hazardous atmosphere. Respirators have to be NIOSH approved. In the picture there, you see what sometimes people refer to as, dust masks. So, dust masks come in a variety of styles and brands, but not all dust masks provide adequate protection for workplace dust. So only NIOSH approved dust masks can be used for protection against dust levels. So single strap dust masks are not typically NIOSH approved. So there you can see on the screen there. And some of them have that exhalation valve, like the picture on the right. So there's 2 types of respirators. There's an air purifying and an air supplying respirator. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but it keeps going back to your hazard assessment, is what type of respiratory hazards are you exposing your workers to? And will they need a respirator that purifies the air, or will they need a respirator that is going to supply them with the air? So what air purifying does is that it removes the contaminants by passing the air through a filter or some kind of filtering medium. So it could be a filter, it could be a cartridge, or it could be a canister. The supplied air is kind of exactly as it sounds. So these respirators supply breathing air to the user from that external source. So it can be compressed gas cylinder, or it can be a compressor. And these typically consist of, the respirator, there's an air supply hose, there's pressure fittings, it could be a hood, or it could be a helmet, or it could be a tight fitting face piece, or it could be a complete suit. And so here's just some pictures to give you an idea of the different types. So to the left is the air purifying, to the right is the air supplying. So the air purifying removes contaminants by passing air through the filtering medium, as I mentioned. Disposable or reusable, and powered or non-powered. So the dust masks they're simple 2-strap disposable dust masks, are designed only for dust. They're not protective. They're not as protective as other respirators, but they do an adequate job in many cases, unless the dust is really toxic or in copious amounts. But don't confuse these 2-strap masks with the less protective 1-strap mask, designed only for pollen or non-toxic dust. Then in the picture there, we have a half face respirator. So they're sometimes called a half face or a half mask respirator, since they cover just the nose and the mouth. They do have removable cartridges that either filter out dust, chemicals, or can be both. Selecting, of course, the correct cartridge is essential, since they are designed for particular types of chemicals or particular dusts. A reputable respirator vendor certainly can help you in selecting the correct cartridges if you can tell them what the exposure may be. Those cartridges are typically removable, and they are sometimes interchangeable. Cartridges are available, for solvents or ammonia, chlorine, acids, or other chemicals. The cartridges must be changed out or replaced periodically, especially for chemicals, since they can absorb, only so much before the breakthrough occurs, and then they're not going to provide a worker with that protection. So a few cartridges are equipped with an end of service indicator, kind of to show you when they must be replaced. But again, that would have to be covered off in your respiratory protection program as well, about a change out schedule. Most cartridges don't have that indicator, so you need to develop that change out schedule. And that change out schedule will be based on your chemical concentration, the physical work effort, the temperature, and the humidity. So again, if this is not something that you are keenly familiar with, then the supplier or the manufacturer may be able to or help you, assist you with that. And so many respirator manufacturers have actually that change out schedule calculator on the internet. Then you have the full face. So in some situations, you may need or want to use a full face respirator. So that type of respirator is used when the air contaminant may also irritate the eyes. They also provide somewhat higher protection to the lungs, since they tend to fit tighter and are less prone to leakage. So these respirators also have replaceable cartridges that must be changed on a regular basis, the same as I described for the half face. Then we switch over to the air supplying. We have the powered air purifying, on the bottom of the screen there, we have the powered air purifying respirators, and they have a battery pack that draws air through a replaceable cartridge and blows it into a full face piece, a helmet, or a hood. So these respirators are often more comfortable if someone is working in hot weather, and some can provide more protection depending on the type that's used. And again, those cartridges has to be changed out. Our air purifying certainly would not be for use in unknown or oxygen deficient or enriched atmospheres, or atmospheres that are immediately dangerous to life or health. If there's concentrations above the assigned protection value of that respirator, and we'll talk about that in a minute, or if there's any interference with the respirator seal. And then certainly on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the air supplied respirators. So the assigned protection factor that I just mentioned is a value assigned by the CSA, which indicates the level of protection granted by the respirator if it's worn properly. So for example, a respirator with an assigned protection value of 10 will protect workers up to 10 times the threshold limit value. So that's safe concentration exposure. A respirator must not be used for protection against concentrations of an air contaminant greater than that assigned protection value. And the assigned protection value must be applied in the respirator selection process. So again, if this is something that you are not keenly familiar with, there are certainly resources out there that would help you in selecting the appropriate respirator. So of course, you can't really talk about respirator protection without talking about filters. So the filters remove the particulates by passing air through a woven material with an electrostatic charge. And the color code for the filters is magenta. Okay, and some people, may hear people calling them, the pink patties. Then we have the cartridges. So you'll see filters on some air purifying respirators, and you'll see cartridges on others. So with a cartridge, the air passes through a treated absorbent material, which causes the molecules then to stick to that cartridge. And these ones are color coded based on the chemical or vapor exposure. And you'll see there on the right-hand side of the screen the different color codes. And again, this is something that the manufacturer can help you with. So cartridges would act similar to a sponge. They would soak up that vapor or that chemical or gas. And of course, we know that at some point that would get at its maximum. That would be saturated and would no longer then absorb any more of that of those molecules, which again then proves that that is going to be ineffective in providing protection. So the breakthrough means the chemical goes through the cartridge, into the face piece. So if you smell the chemical with your respirator on, you know that it's not working. But if the chemical has no odor, or if it can only be detected at high levels above the permissible limits, you may not know if your respirator is working properly or not, until it's too late and then you have been exposed. So that's why they need to be changed out regularly. And there are gases and vapors for which, there is no effective cartridge. Then we have hearing protection covered under Section 68 of the regulations. So 25% of workers are regularly exposed to noise above the limit, and 99.99% of noise-induced hearing loss is preventable if proper hearing protection is used. So Section 68 of the regulations covers off noise hazards, and you will note that if you're looking through the legislation that this is not covered off in the PPE section, so it's not lumped together with all the other references to personal protective equipment. So when a worker is required to work in an area which noise levels exceed the American Conference of Government Industrial Hygienists, or ACGIH, specifications, the employer has to implement control measures to try to reduce the noise down to acceptable levels. So can we eliminate the noise? Can we isolate the worker from the noise? Can we put administrative controls in place? And then is there personal protective equipment? So where it's not practical to reduce the noise or to isolate the workers from the noise, then the workers have to wear hearing protection. And that hearing protection has to comply with CSA's Ad 94.2, hearing protection devices, performances, selection, care, and use. And that was revised in 2014 and reaffirmed in 2019. So hearing protection devices, or HPDs, reduce the level of noise reaching the ear. So there's no single type of HPD that will work for everyone or for every task. So on this slide, we have some examples. So there's earplugs. So they work by blocking the ear canal. They're either made from a preformed flexible vinyl material, and they come in sizes to fit different sizes of ear canals, or they can be made from, formable materials that can be manipulated to conform to the shape of a specific wearer's ear canals. So, my dad shoots out at the Rod and Gun Club, and he has these formed for his ears. Then you can get ear canal caps. So they're a variation of the earplugs. The canal caps consist of, small stoppers which seal against the entrance to the ear canal by the force of a band, which is usually worn under the chin or behind the neck. Ear canal caps generally provide less protection than earplugs or ear muffs, and they are less comfortable as well for long-term use. Then there's the custom molded earplugs. So they're made by taking impressions of an individual's ears, very much like a 3D model of the ear canal. Ears are just as individual and distinct as a fingerprint, which means, it can be a challenge to find earplugs which suit all employees or which everyone finds comfortable. So custom molded earplugs provide maximum comfort and attenuation, and can potentially last for years if they're, properly cared for and maintained and stored. And then we have ear muffs. So ear muffs enclose the external air inside rigid domes. So the inside of the dome, is lined with acoustic foam, and the perimeter of the dome is fitted with a liner that would seal against the head by the force of the headband and assembly. So depending on their design, the ear muff headbands may be worn independently or as part of a hard hat, so you may see it as attached as in the picture there. Ear muffs normally provide maximum protection when placed on a flat, smooth surface, thus less protection is expected if they're worn over hair or over glasses or any uneven surface. So the effectiveness of an ear muff is determined by the headband tension and fit of the domes over the ears. So if the headband tension decreases over time, either by routine usage or if there's any interference with an uneven surface, then the noise reduction then would also decrease. Now, there are certainly advantages and disadvantages to each one. Just as an example, for earplugs and canal caps, advantages that they are comfortable to insert, they are inexpensive, they can be reused, but if they're not placed far enough in the ear canal, then the full protection is not provided, and it does require reliance on the worker to put them in properly, and they could be getting dirty depending if the workers have soiled hands. With the custom earplugs, as I mentioned, they are shaped to the individual, so they are easier to insert typically, and there's less likely to experience any pain from extended use. With the ear muffs, one advantage is that they can be worn on the head or on hard hats, and they fit over the entire external air. You know, they are ideal in low temperatures, and they're ideal if you're in and out of noisy environments for kind of taking them on and putting them back on. However, effectiveness will decrease, as I mentioned, as the headband tension decreases, and they may not fit all workers, or they could be uncomfortable as well if you're wearing it in conjunction with other PPE. So then it comes down to that compatibility factor. And certainly they can become uncomfortable if it's really hot. And they're not going to be ideal for someone, you know, if they have glasses. So I mentioned a noise reduction rating. So hearing protection devices are marked with a noise reduction rating, or an NRR. The NRR is the level of noise reduction expected when the device is worn properly and it fits properly. So a noise reduction rating of 30 will reduce noise levels by 30 dBA. Okay, so on the slide there it says 33. So again, when used as directed, it would reduce noise levels by 33 dBA. So noise reduction rating for each of the types that we mentioned. So earplugs, they have an effective noise rating of 50%. Ear muffs, 70%. And then if you wear double hearing protection, so earplugs and muffs, dual protection, 60%. That's the effective rating. So with respect to double hearing protection, I guess as a comparison, single hearing protection, average noise levels above the occupational exposure limit, so that 85 dBA for an 8-hour shift, but below the 105 dBA. So that's where we would wear single hearing protection. Double hearing protection would be ideal where the average noise levels are above 105 decibels. So exposures above 140 decibels are not permitted. So doubling hearing protection effectively adds 5 noise reduction rating to the highest noise reduction rating for that hearing protection device. So comfort and fit, certainly the most common problem with earplugs is that they are not seated deeply enough into the ear canals. So partial insertion results in poor noise reduction and poor retention and then discomfort. So likewise, you know, the ear muffs are not snug against the head if potentially the ear plugs are not fitting properly, and as well if the ear muffs are not fitting snug against the head, they're going to leak noise into the ear. So for formable earplugs, they must be rolled between the thumb and the forefinger to compress them, and then inserted into the ear canal and held in place as that earplug expands to fill the canal and seal against its walls. So when the plugs are properly inserted, there will be a slight sensation of pressure, and the wearer's voice will sound louder and more resonant. And there will also be some resistance when the user gently, pulls on the earplug. So properly inserted earplugs, they should not be painful, but there is no earplug that fits all ear canals either. So certainly that is a challenge and a consideration for your workers, for an employer's workers. So guys, I guess as a recap, and as I know a lot of information in a short period of time, PPE is your last line of defense in controlling hazards. There is a wide variety of personal protective equipment for many hazards. Proper selection, use, and care is important, and that certainly would boil down to having a personal protective equipment program in place with the proper hazard assessment processes, complying certainly with legislation and CSA standards, and making sure that people are properly fitted and educated in how to, care and maintain and use their personal protective equipment. So this week is North American Safety and Health Week, and the goal of this week is to focus attention on the importance of preventing injury and illness in the workplace, at home, and in the community. We're, I guess, through the better part of the week now, but Workplace NL did offer daily webinars this week to increase that knowledge and promote a healthy mind and body. Coming up tomorrow, we have the last webinar in our week-long series for Safety and Health Week, and that's mental health in the workplace. And then next week, we have due diligence coming up on May 12th, and we have early and safe return to work on May 13th. For a complete list of our dates and topics of our webinars, you can visit our website at the link that's there on the slide there, and Tina will post the link in your chat window as well. And of course, if you want to receive updated information on our webinars and hopefully soon our in-person workshops, then you can visit our website, scroll to the bottom of the screen and click all events. And from there, you can subscribe to receive our emails with our upcoming events. And Tina will put that link there in your chat window, as I mentioned. So your feedback is important. So if you take the time to complete the evaluation, we would certainly appreciate it. I do thank you for attending this morning's webinar. I know we're a few minutes over, but thank you so much for participating. Should you have any questions, certainly type them in your chat window, or I'll answer them in a personal email to you. And Tina will put my contact information there in the chat window as well. And if you have any general questions about Workplace NL, you can certainly contact